So Professor Ben Shafer, he's a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University. He's a former department head there. He is a internationally known expert in thin-walled structures, cold-formed steel. He's also very active besides his faculty work in consulting. He's vice president of VBM Technologies. In addition to that, he's very involved in professional activities as well, and serves on the specification committee, not only for ISC steel structures, but AISI, related to thin-walled structures. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ben Shafer.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back here at Minnesota, and a distinct pleasure to get to participate in the Dexter Lecture Series. I knew Bob a little bit. I was a little bit more junior, but we crossed paths in the steel structures world. And of course, the legacy of his research is something that I'm faced with, the changes he made to the codes, and something that we often end up talking about. So I've certainly had a nice exposure to his contributions, and glad to do a little bit of participation here. I begin this talk as is not uncommon for people with acknowledgments, but for me, this particular topic is a little bit different than what I do when I normally lecture as a professor, and the acknowledgments are a little bit different as well. So the first gentleman on there, Delbert Schafer, is my father. Upon his retirement, I decided he didn't have enough to do, and I tried to offload some of my work to him, which was a particular interest in the history of structures, which he had no interest in at the beginning, but over a lot of work and time, I have now turned him into a structures nerd as well. And so he's actually done a lot of the heavy lifting and research for some of the historical aspects of this work. The other gentlemen on the list include two close colleagues, Sanjay Arwade and Steve Bonapani. We were graduate students together at Cornell, not unlike some of you in the room today. And we were first exposed to this idea of structural art, which is a concept of David Billington's, and we thought it was a key thing that was missing in the curriculums around the country. I now teach a course about that topic at Johns Hopkins University. Sanjay teaches his at UMass Amherst, and Steve Bonapani at Bucknell. And the last person is Thomas Leslie, who I do not know well, but who is an actual serious science of history Chicago scholar. And so I will refer you to Tom's book. He is at Iowa State, not so terribly far away from here, for any additional details that you might want to know about the birth of the skyscraper. It is really fantastic, and many of the things I learned from Tom. So no matter where you look in the world, when you think about a city, the steel skyscrapers of that city have come to be part of the iconic definition of what makes that city a city. So whether you're in Chicago or you're in Hong Kong or even Minneapolis, a little bit less. I was trying to find even more steel skyscrapers, but you'll get there. I see the cranes, I believe. But the point is, this has become really a key element of our urban environment. And the question is sort of, how did we get here? How did we come to have this many structures? And the story of the birth of the skyscraper is one that has many aspects and has a particular moment in time where we tend to say, oh, and then things changed and we got the skyscraper. And it's centered around Chicago after the 1871 Chicago fire. And the economic conditions and social conditions and geographic conditions that all caused there to be a need for more buildings in one particular region. Chicago in particular, that area of Chicago is very strangely constrained. It has, of course, the lake on the east. It had a bunch of rail on the west side of the Central Business District. And that rail was critically important to the entire nation. It was the major north-south rail thoroughfare and a major nexus west to east as well. And so a huge amount of American shipping went through that region. And so there was a huge desire to essentially be in the areas of Chicago where everything burned down. In addition, through this time, the 1870s, 1880s, you see the emergence of a lot of corporations, essentially, which have white-collar workers for the first time. Lots of people that are going to do the accounting and push the pencils for these types of firms, and they want them all together. And so rather than being a factory, there's this desire for an urban core, the first true central business district. And so there is a lot of money external to Chicago. There's a lot of social conditions in Chicago where they want buildings and they want density. And so this becomes the place where there's this big chase to eventually build taller and taller, and the skyscraper will be born and then reborn again. So how did it come to be in terms of the engineering, and who actually does this? Is more the story that I want to tell today. And it's an interesting one from my perspective because it is a story that every single architecture student could tell you. Because the first Chicago school is the first school of architecture that's different than classical architecture. In effect, up until the early 1900s, the late 1800s, there is no new architecture. There is only the architecture from the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, Gothic. There was no attempt or even desire for anyone that practiced in the building arts to make a new architecture. And so when they're taught about modern architecture, they begin with the first Chicago school. And they learn these names. They learn about Adler and Sullivan and Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root and Major Jenny, of which Root, Adler, and Jenny are engineers. So these are the champions of this new breed of architecture. They're understood, and you can go to many first-year architecture students and get these names out of them, and yet we don't know them as engineers. And they are an interesting cast of characters that help bring this world to life. Major Jenny is called Major because of his work during the Civil War, and he keeps that title the rest of his life. So if you work at his firm, you call him Major Jenny, even though he hadn't been a major for decades. And Burnham and Root go on to be sort of major players in designing the first steel skyscrapers, and Adler and Sullivan as well. And some of you may know the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who was spent a number of years with Louis Sullivan. So the story about the skyscraper, its birth, and who is sort of majorly involved is typically told often through the vein of Adler and Sullivan, Louis Sullivan's contributions, what he passes on to Frank Lloyd Wright, sometimes about Daniel Burnham, often about Major Jenny, credited with giving us one of the first high-rise buildings. But in my research, and it may be because I came from Hopkins, the preeminent Hopkins scholar of the 20th century was a faculty member, Johns Hopkins, and he spent his entire life studying this man, John Wellborn Root, sort of one of the least known of the characters. And I think his story is really interesting, resonates well with me, resonates with things that we try to do when we train engineers. And so it's his story that I want to tell today through the vein of him creating some of the buildings that would become the first skyscrapers. Some of the quotes that you'll find in the time to kind of understand his contribution was essentially that they were focused on tall buildings in the central business district, and they were one of the first to really recognize what they were up to and express it in a way that we understand it as a skyscraper. And then Daniel Burnham's quote about Wellborn Root is essentially, yes, we made all these buildings together, but they are chiefly his, for it was he who did the designing. And that is seriously true. Burnham was an incredible salesperson, but he did not involve himself too much in the details once the job was made. Root was actually the person choosing the form and working out the details. So what I would like to do is trace the influences a little bit of John Wellborn Root and then take us back to that moment in Chicago when all this building starts to happen. And so I want to give you a little bit of the character of the man and a brief understanding of his life. So it's kind of interesting. So he's born in the South, and this is pre-Civil War, but it's when the conditions for the Civil War are pretty strong. And his family has some means, and they believe that the Civil War is coming, and so they actually ship him to a distant relative in Liverpool. And so he does his, essentially what we call 9th, 10th grade, and then high school in Liverpool, England, where he would have been exposed mightily to the Industrial Revolution in its full glory. So, I mean, the large train sheds, the explosion of rail traffic, the really large structures that were happening at this time actually were happening in the UK. And so he's right there as all of this construction is occurring. And so when he comes back to the US immediately following the Civil War and wants to go to school, he decides that he would like to be involved in that kind of building as well. And there is really only one school of civil engineering at the time, which is at NYU. And so he goes and chooses there for his education. And so he gets his education in New York, and then he comes out and he's looking for his first job, and he becomes a architect's helper. What we know from our friends that end up working at the DOT, the guy that has the rod end of the surveying stick. And so essentially this is his first job, and he's working at the train station that they're building for the new Grand Central Station in New York. This is probably a roof that is not familiar to you. That's because it no longer exists. It had a relatively short life. It was designed to be built and look like Paddington Station in terms of the detailing they did for the ironwork on the top. It was a really remarkable large span structure, his first exposure to large steel structures. His boss at the time is a man by the name of Peter White. And Mr. White runs a relatively large-scale firm in New York City, and the Chicago fire happens, and he does not have an office in Chicago, but perceives that there would be a great opportunity if he did have an office in Chicago to get a lot of work. So he has this now 21-year-old John Wellborn Root on his staff, who he thinks is a pretty good fellow, and he tells him, "Why don't you go start my office in Chicago and go get this work." And so he then is sent off to Chicago as his sort of first extenuation of his first job to run this office. They have a real challenge ahead of them in Chicago. So there is a large group of engineers and practitioners there. They want to rebuild, and there's a serious discussion about what it's going to mean to try to do that. And the first few years of rebuilding are just all over the place. Nothing really good is happening. They're just rebuilding slapdash as fast as they can to put people back under buildings, and there's nothing to really talk about. It's really, first whole 10 years are like that. So in this time when they're building like crazy, but they're not really figured out what they want to do, there is amongst this group of people and the engineers involved a lot of discussion about what it means to try to restore buildings. Or to restore a lost area like this. And you can find lots of letters, and you can go to the Society of Civil Engineering meeting sort of at this time, and there's a lot of discussion about restoration and reparation and what will it mean to build. And there is, this is happening both in Europe and the United States. In the United States, we're primarily doing new building, but there's this group of Chicago engineers that are particularly interested because they're dealing in this sort of collapsed area, and they're trying to put everything back together again. And in Europe, they're sort of building as they come into the Industrial Revolution on top of their extant architecture. And so they have a lot of deep discussions with there being two major proponents for what we should do when we're doing restoration. One, John Ruskin, and the other, Viollet-le-Duc. And in fact, the reason I bring these names up is not to be academic, but when John Wellborn Root or others try to explain themselves, they actually say, "I'm a proponent of Ruskin, and thus I believe this," or "I'm a proponent of Le-Duc, and so I think we should do this." And so this is very much tied into their own discussion of work. And so the idea of Ruskin is that it's impossible to restore anything, and basically that we have to we leave it alone to the greatest extent possible, and anything we do, like if you're going to replace a doorknob, then you go find that same doorknob somewhere else from that same time period, and you replace it exactly as you can in kind. And then there is Viollet-le-Duc, which essentially is to say, like, once you're touching it, you know you're going to change it, and so you have to take it, you're going to be taking it to a state that it never existed before, and so there should be clarity in what's new and what's old. And this is very much a debate that goes on today. And so Le-Duc has a simple statement that Root really holds on to dearly, and which he sort of talks about in his own writings, that structure makes form. And so Le-Duc's work was, and it's a sort of bold thing to say this, is he spent most of his career restoring cathedrals. So he's looking at these buildings, which we look at as primarily architectural, and he's arguing that they are primarily structural, and that their shape is a structure that makes their form and their beauty, and that there's only beauty in a building to the extent to which the problem, the actual physics problem it solved, is confronted and solved in an optimal way. This is a contrarian view of beauty. It is counterculture to an architectural view of beauty. It is one that is very aligned with the ideas of structural art, David Billington, and a group of thinkers, but it is not certainly the only way. But it's what Leduc thought, and it's what Root embraced. To give you just a taste of their arguments so that you can understand what they're saying, there were a series of studies done about Gothic cathedrals to understand the way they performed as structures. And one of the things that they looked at was these little pinnacles up here. Are they there because they're a nice little spire that gives it a little pointy top that makes it sort of fun to look at? Or are they there because they serve a purpose? What you'll find out is that having this mass, this additional mass outboard, and these were studies done by Robert Mark at Princeton and have been redone by John Oxendorf in the modern age, the actual stress, the actual additional compressive stress you find at the toe, at the outside of that masonry, is significant, enough to take you from sort of a realm of service winds cause mortar to uplift to service winds wouldn't. And so the thought is that this really did evolve because there probably were cathedrals without these, and you probably had mortar cracking, and that over time they said, well, you know, if you put a little more weight on the top of that buttress, it'll probably make that crack close, and that what we now just look at as a Gothic detail, and we might make something out of steel and put that same detail on it to say, oh, it looks Gothic because it's got the shape of Gothic, was a shape that was selected because it makes the form to make the structure work. And what Leduc was saying was that he's got these new materials which the engineers in the past or the builders in the past didn't have. He's got iron and things like that. And so he's suggesting that we can still build in the Gothic tradition, but the Gothic tradition was to use that structure as efficiently as possible. And this was his example of how you might do cathedral renovations when you were going to integrate iron or transportation integrations. It's very interesting because they're different than what you're used to seeing, because it mixes materials and forms in a way that you haven't necessarily seen before. So this was Root's boss. And at this point, you might be wondering why have so many people commented about Root. It's because, and I actually hadn't quite realized this in time, but he died when he was 48 years old, which is the same time as Bob. He died of pneumonia, so he died young. And so there was a lot of people willing to comment on him when it was still sort of the heart of his career. And what he said was that Root really understood what Viollet-le-Duc was getting at. It's one of the happy few that understood that this Gothic revival wasn't about making Gothic shapes, but it was about applying the best constructive principles of the best Gothic work of the 12th and 13th century to the materials, facilities, and necessities of our time. All right, so that is the person who's trying to solve this problem. We have a totally destroyed central business district, and we would now like to rebuild it. So that gives you a little bit of taste of John Root. So he designed a number of buildings in this relatively brief period after the fire. I've selected a small number of them to take you through because these particular buildings sort of illustrate specific advantages and advancements that Root had and provided. So Montauk Block, Rookery, Montauk, Rand McNally Building, Reliance Building, and then I'll give you the denouement about where we're at sort of today, maybe on some of these ideas. So the first building may not make you go, wow, woo, there's a skyscraper, but that is it. That's the first building to be called a skyscraper in print. It's Montauk Block. It's completed in 1882. You can see it's about, I can't remember now, 9 or 10 stories tall. There are a couple of interesting things about it. Kind of like a modern startup, they built buildings and then they would put their office in that building. So they built Montauk Block and then Burnham and Root moved into Montauk Block. One of the reasons they had to build Montauk Block was the Grannis building, which they had been in before, right before this one was complete, burned down after the Chicago fire. So they're still having fire problems. And the third one is there's a major innovation in foundation design for these buildings. So let's start with the third one. Chicago was a very difficult place to build. it has the worst soil conditions possible for trying to build tall buildings. It has this sort of hardpan layer of soil beneath it for like 12 to 15 feet that like looks pretty good. You're like, you do a boring on it, you're like, ah, this is good stuff. But that only lasts for a small amount, and then you have an enormously large layer of compressible, squishy clay before you get another hardpan layer and rock. So the answer to how to deal with this in the past for smaller buildings at the time was at the base of each column, okay, you would build out a little stone pyramid. Right, so one block and then 4 around that and then another round and another round to spread out the load beneath each column. Right, so it's reasonable for a relatively small building, nice way to go. And you're just making, the reason they learned to do that over time in Chicago was because if they didn't do that, the building would have differential settlement and would fall and have all sorts of cracking and problems. The challenge with a larger building like this is with the weight of all the masonry, they would calculate that that pyramid for the columns would need to end somewhere about here. Because you can't keep putting the pyramid further and further down in the ground. It's got to rest on top of the hardpan, and you've only got 12 feet of it. So this building would have basically no rentable, usable space in the first 2 stories, right? You would just walk in and there would be this field of Egyptian pyramids. So that wouldn't work. And so they're a little bit flummoxed about what to do. They came up with the idea for the modern mat foundation. And so what Root said was, you know, we have all of these railroad ties everywhere I look, all these railroad lines and railroad ties, whatever. And so if I just make a grillage of literally railroad line just in each direction, and I fill that up with what was a sort of early version of concrete that they were using. And then I put that underneath the columns, then that will be stiff enough to spread out the load. And so literally, they went in, and they're still just resting right on top of the hardpan layer. They put in their grillage of railroad members, and then they filled it up with concrete, and that became the first mat foundation that existed and became a commonly used technique in Chicago. And it's also one of the few things, there were engineers that worked at the firm of Burnham and Root. They do not have the same level of stature, but one particular engineer by the name of Ewan holds a patent, one of the first patents for the mat foundation. So I mentioned that their previous building, the Montauk Block, burned down. So one of the other interesting advantages of the Montauk Block, it was the first quote-unquote skyscraper and the first tall building to have fireproofing for both the columns and the floors. This was the big breakthrough. So Montauk Block, like other buildings, there were a lot of cast iron riveted parts that existed. This is pictures a little bit later when we were using steel. And they would put terracotta on the outside of that. And at the end of the fire, the Montauk Block, there's all these columns with terracotta on them on the ground because all the floors had been lost. And so the solution to that was to add these tile arches in between the beams in order to provide additional fireproofing. So this was the first successful fireproofing in a tall building. And there actually was a fire in its 3rd year of life, but it was compartment maintained as we would sort of like it to be in modern times and caused no significant damage. And so this became the sort of early way to fireproof buildings, and this was Root's design. The second major building for us to look at, which shows a little bit further skill in the detailing of what Root would do, is a building known as the Rookery. This is the Rookery. It is, whereas Montauk Block is destroyed, the Rookery is still in Chicago. You can visit it to this day. It was completed in 1886. It was called the Rookery because it's across, it was at the time it was across the street from a city services or city hall building where the politicians had their offices, and there was a kind of abandoned lot where the birds would always stay next on the wires and everything else or whatever, and so people used to call that lot the Rookery because that's where you would go to feed cash to the politician, because you couldn't go meet him in his office, right? So you go meet him in the little lot next door and feed him cash and get what you wanted, and so when they built the building, they decided to keep the name of the lot. So why are we interested in the Rookery? Well, a couple of reasons. It has some innovations in it that have actually recently come back to light. So the building has the exterior that you see here, but it also has an interior which is open from roof down to the base. And this is a modern concept in green buildings. Norman Foster's Commerce-Bank building is celebrated for taking a large skyscraper and putting a light well in it. But it was common practice, and it originated here in Chicago. And the reason was simple. It's normally simple. You guys aren't used to windows. See, people like windows, all right? And so everybody wants a window. And so the idea is you couldn't rent space where there weren't windows. And so the people on the inside, as well as the people on the outside of their offices, would all have windows. So that's the big premise there. In addition, you'll also notice there's a change. Dark things where you filled in a lot is stone. All right, so that's a thick wall. And you'll see back here on some of this interiors, and then back here, it's not so thick anymore. And actually, this building, all of the interior framing is now iron columns and iron beams. And the last load-bearing masonry is just existing on the exterior of the building. So this is all the masonry that's left. And so what it means is if you go into the light well and you look at the building, it looks very different. So this is what the building looks like on its inside core. And this is the first time when you look at a building, you'll see the columns and the beams so clearly expressed. It doesn't just look like a stone sort of, just brick on brick on brick or whatever. You can actually see that there are members underneath, simple columns and beams. You can also see that the man really understood architecture, at least at some level. This beautiful spiral staircase made of iron, which is inside it. He also understood services and space. This is an innovation that you'll often see in a building. They say, oh, we really got crafty this time. We moved the elevators outside of the major office floor plan so that we could have maximum flexibility. And this is the exact same thing. He just moved the staircase basically outside of his floor plan so that you could use it, but the floor plan would stay the same for all of the rentable space. And it's gorgeous. This is the interior of the building. This is the light well. So above that's just all light and the rest of the building. This is the main lobby of the building. You can see that he absorbed something in his time in school and his time in the UK, seeing these wonderful train stations and how you can use iron. And when an engineering solution was needed because the spans were large, he knew how to create that solution both economically and efficiently, but also with elegance. There's one thing about this, though, is that actually, that's really pretty, but Frank Lloyd Wright ruined this. This is the actual original lobby with all the cast iron exposed. There was a restoration done by Frank Lloyd Wright several years later in which he brought in all of this stone, completely missing the point that the idea isn't for you to think that this is some massive column, but for you to realize how slender and beautiful all of these iron structures could be. And that is exactly what Root would write about. And so it proves that when you go to touch somebody else's work, take the time to understand what they were trying to do in addition to what you might want to do. Frank Lloyd Wright's version is beautiful, but it's beautiful because of its artistry. This is beautiful because of its structure. And to me, those are very different things. I really like the original version. This is the outside. Clearly, at this point, there's still a lot of detailing. There's some different types of architecture being embraced in the facade. And Root would write that he was proud of this building, but he was never happy with the way the external facade came off. He spent years of his life trying to make it, and this is where he ended up. But it's richer than he intended it to be, and doesn't provide as direct a sense of its solution as he wanted. The other thing that's interesting about this building is, again, Burnham and Root moved. So their offices were here, and they're at sort of the height of their powers at this time. And this gives you some idea of what it was like to be a practicing engineer in the 1890s at the best possible firm. So first of all, you've got your own sort of library here. So just take a look at some of the things here. So this is Mr. Burnham's private office, Mr. Root's private office, Mr. Root's studio, the unnamed chief engineer. The dude had a name. His name was Ewan, and he worked with him for 12 years, but he doesn't get his name on the drawing. This is the gymnasium. So Burnham he wanted to do stuff during the day, and I'm not sure he had a lot to do. And he liked to fence. And so he had a theory that it would be good for people to learn to fence and to fence with him. So he had his own gymnasium up there in the building. And you can just imagine coming over to the drafting tables and asking some poor schlep to put on the equipment so that he could poke at him for a few hours. And now listen, so if you didn't read it already, now read Burnham's quote. And this is Burnham. Don't you know that you can hire any number of civil engineers, mechanical engineers, and electrical engineers who will absolutely contented to spend their whole lives doing routine. So it's clearly not a lot of respect for what's being added. As a little side note to his hubris, a few years after this quote, he was in charge, and this is after Root's death, he was in charge of doing a major renovation in a hotel in Kansas City, which is where I'm from, and the joists collapsed because he drew them on a line and said those will be joists and never sized them. And after that, he hired an engineer by the name of Shankland, who was a very fine engineer, would go on to do a lot of bridge engineering, design some of the first high-rises in San Francisco, and understood it was worth spending some of his money to have actual engineering. But you could see where he started from, and it wasn't, what shall we say, a good place. Okay, let's talk about Monadnock. So one of the architectural critics of the time, in reference to Monadnock, simply said that this is the thing itself. This is the first Chicago school. This is what we mean when we talk about one of these new skyscraper buildings. This building has a number of interesting stories associated with it. It was, when it was on the boards, it was going to be the tallest building in the world. When it was finally completed, that did not turn out to be the case. It was the tallest building on the boards. The other thing about it that's quite interesting is that it was originally designed, let me just see if I can find that. Yes, I'm not sure I can find the exact quote. I'll find it in time. It still exists today. You can see it there, and there's some drawings on the left. So you saw in his buildings that he's removing the masonry, right? So he's removing the masonry for a lot of reasons, but this building clearly has a strong masonry aesthetic on the outside. And so he had actually proposed to the funding for this, which is a couple of gentlemen in Boston, that this should be the first all metal, all steel skyscraper. So let's use beams and columns, the whole thing out of steel. We don't need to use any masonry. You know, we've been building buildings this way now for a number of years, and we just haven't used it on the external area. I don't think there's some concerns about the wind engineering, but we think it's going to be better because it's going to be lighter. They had their reasons why they wanted it to be. There was a lawyer in Boston involved in the financing of the project. He was asked by the two Boston financiers, should we do this or whatever? And the lawyer said, well, a steel building, I mean, no one's done that before, so no, I don't think you should do that. And so at the end of the day, a lawyer decided that this would be the last of the really great masonry buildings instead of the first of the really great steel buildings. So Root took that, embraced that as it was, and did the best he could. You'll notice that this building has, in the final form, it has these bay windows, but other than that, it has essentially no real demarcation of different phases for the building. It's a very simple shape, very direct shape. This is one of his early drawings when he was struggling with how to make this out, and you can really notice the difference between this building, which has this capital region up here, which is very different than here, where he just allows the building essentially to come up and terminate. There was no aesthetic to look to for a skyscraper. How should I build a tall building? What should it look like? And so what was taught at the time, what people believed to be true, is that you should follow something like the orders of columns, like Greek columns. And that basically the idea is you should have what was called a tripartite construction. There should be a noticeable base, a shaft, and a capital. And so you can see here he has created a base structure, and there is his shaft structure, and there is his capital. And this was considered the only way to design buildings. And in fact, now that I've told you that, when you look at masonry buildings anywhere you go in the world, you will see that this is what we do. So all of the buildings in the late 1800s, all the buildings throughout the 1900s, particularly in New York, where the tallest buildings would move to, and where architecture was no big deal to spend more money, base, shaft, capital. You'll always see those three different aspects of the way the building is shaped. But here, it's very subtle. I mean, he's bowed out the bottom a little bit, and he certainly has a shaft. He's allowed the capital to be changed just a little bit, but it's almost non-existent. And so this was, shocking to people at the time, that this is the way a building could look. I mean, it was just not the way they expected a building to look. But it turned out for him that people liked it. This gives you an idea of how the building worked. For its wind design, you can see that it has these large masonry cross walls. So these are all the masonry pieces. Everything else you see that's lighter is iron. He was also concerned with getting light into this building as well, but he didn't have the space on the footprint in order to bring in a large light well. So he had light shafts, essentially about the same size as modern elevators, that were just window shafts that brought light down into the building as far as he could. This is what it looks like today. That is like an IRS building, which is across the street, a modern steel facade building. But it's really remarkable, really simple building, definitely worth your time for a visit next time you make it down into Chicago. So the first time that in this case, the cast iron, it will soon be steel. Sorry, I keep wanting to say steel, but the cast iron is everywhere, including on the exterior of the building. And the building that most people credit as being the first skyscraper, because it uses steel, or iron systems, metallic systems for both the floors and the columns on both the exterior and the interior, is Major Jenny's home insurance building. Major Jenny actually designed an enormous number of buildings at the time. A side story I didn't tell you. So Root goes to Chicago, and he's supposed to work for White, right? And so he's going around, and they're like, "Who's this New York engineer that's gonna do our buildings?" And so he quickly realizes that he's not going to make a lot of money being the guy in charge of White's business or whatever. And so he takes a job with Major Jenny. And so he's in the drafting room with Major Jenny's firm, because he's already got the jobs in hand to design several of the buildings. And the guy on the drafting table next to him is Daniel Burnham. And Burnham prefers to smoke and fence rather than spend time at the drafting table, but he's also a dreamer, and he's also a good salesperson. And he spends a very amount of time, they spend less than 6 months at Jenny's firm or whatever, and Burnham convinces him, "We should start our own firm." Whatever. He said, "Because I can see that you can actually do this work, and I like selling it." And so that's how they leave and form Burnham and Root as two young men meeting in Major Jenny's firm. So you can imagine a little bit of competition between their old boss and this young upstart firm. So the home insurance building, generally credited with being the first building of having this design. But it still has masonry. But it's now just a facade, but it's cast iron. So it's not the first steel skyscraper, it's the first iron skyscraper. And you can see the design is not something that is Jenny's buildings were very functional. He met sort of the aesthetic demands of the time, but he wasn't trying to do something else. Root was really struggling to try to bring a new form to life. He wasn't always successful, but it was something he was really interested in doing. The Rand McNally building, which was, so here is number 2, here is the Rookery, and just across the street, number 4 is the Rand McNally building. It doesn't exist to this day. You can see the huge light well again. This is the first building to be designed with a steel skeletal system. So one of the first early tall steel skyscraper style buildings. It also has some interesting features. See this building right here, number 3? This existed before number 4 was built. All right, so this building is already in existence when they go to build the Rand McNally building. And so it's a real challenge to do the foundation for this building. And in fact, you can see this is the drawings for how the foundation goes right next to building number 3 there. And then as they actually drag it in with this sort of big plate girder system and then pull the load into the foundation here. So it was a challenging building to design. And there's 2 primary reasons that they designed in steel. They needed to decrease the demands on this building. And they needed to get mass out of it because they couldn't make the foundation work. All right, so they could not get, they have this cantilever problem at the bottom, but they also just have all this load, which is too close to this existing foundation. So they get a ton of the mass out of the building in terms of the dead load of the masonry is no longer needs to be load bearing, and so they get that out. Another major secret is that when we did design, even back in the day, there was a safety factor. And the safety factor for a cast iron column in 1895 is 8. So you calc it, and then use a factor of 8. And for these new steel columns, the factor was, based on the fact that they felt the riveted columns were more, was a factor of 4. So you just took your structural system, which is a lot of your self-weight, and just by changing the factor of safety, you just halved it. And by removing all of the load-bearing masonry, you have the load again. So basically, they were able to get a huge amount of mass out of the building with those innovations. Well, it's a successful building. You can see what it looks like, big light well and everything. Here's an elevation section through the center of the building. And I'd like everyone to take a look at that and see if it strikes you that it might or might not be missing anything. Does look like a reasonable gravity system, I would argue. It's not so obvious how it stands up in wind. In fact, this was a major debate. So this is a little quote about steel columns, but and there you can see some of the columns, types of columns that would have gone into the building. But speaking to the wind, this is an engineering record quote from 1893 that I really like because I've been at committee meetings as recently as a month ago where this same quote could have been said. It says, "The construction of skeleton buildings has but recently been commenced, hence, but little opportunity has been afforded to test them in the face of ordinarily destructive winds. As a general rule, however, it may be considered very indifferent engineering that is fortified only by a lack of failure. If a construction is sound in principle, it can be shown to be so. But if its character is not capable of a clear defense, it can only be regarded with well-grounded suspicion." So that is, lack of failure doesn't tell you a damn thing. So the fact that it doesn't fall down when you don't expect it to fall down doesn't tell you anything. Can you explain to me how it works? If yes, let's continue. If not, no go. And so there was a lot of work to figure out how could these buildings stand up in lateral loads. So there's the idea of using rod bracing, various versions of knee bracing, these wonderful portal braces, which look really nice but super expensive. And a number of different solutions. The solution that hadn't been yet invented was to positively connect the column to the beam so they could transmit moment to one another. All right? Everything they had learned was post and beam type construction where you set things on top of one another, right? So the idea of like actually connecting and having a moment connection didn't exist, right? It didn't exist until the Reliance building. So the first moment connection for steel construction happened in a Burnham and Root design building called the Reliance building. This occurred, it was on the boards when Root passed away. He was involved in the initial design, but the actual creation of the Reliance building happened after his death. This is the Reliance building completed in 1895. Atwood and Shanklin, who are basically, Atwood is the gentleman who replaces Root after he passes away, and Shanklin is the engineer at the firm that Burnham hires after the Kansas City floor collapse, and they create the Reliance building, a building that still exists today. The addition of this moment frame system meant that they also could create a new architectural feature, which we know as the Chicago window, which gives you this really wide open windows. I mean, this is 1895. I would be perfectly happy to move into that today in terms of the amount of sort of openness of the space that they've created. And they did it through Shanklin's design, where he's got these sort of riveted column pieces running through the floor, and he's created sort of positive connections. And the connections are such that he's just figured out where moment couples could be sucked out of this thing. How can I connect it here and then down here so that I can get a moment in this direction, and then same on the other side in order to make this system work. If you wanted to learn more about that and the structural systems, Thomas Leslie's book, who I alluded to in the beginning, would be the person to go to. And here, we have celebrated Root, but we should celebrate the contributions of Mr. Shanklin as well, because this is really high-level engineering. Some additional quotes about who Root is so that you can understand why we've chosen to champion him today. And they speak to the denouement of a few slides that I would like to give. So this is in one of his lectures. He had a series of his writings that were captured, including he lectured to architecture students in Chicago. And he basically makes an argument that if something is very small in scale, then adding decorative detail is fine. And this is sort of the argument that it can be sculpture. But that if its scale is large so that resources are high level in what's involved in it, it is the greatest of architectural crimes to use a great column in a large building for any purpose than primarily to carry weight. It's like, yes. And he likes simplicity, directness, and moderation, and I thank him for that. So what's happened today with these traditions? Architects trace you from the first Chicago school to the second Chicago school, and then to modernism, and they have a whole sort of lineage that they would take you on in order to explain what the impact of the first Chicago school was. Our resources are not quite as vast, but it would be a crime if I did not mention that, two things. First, so the bad story denouement, then the good story. Okay, so the bad story denouement is one of the reasons we like Root is he had the decency to die. All the rest of those folks went on and did a bunch of neoclassical garbage for the rest of their career. So they had 15 years of beautiful buildings in Chicago. Then they got rich, and so then they built what the rich people wanted, which was just copies of any kind of Greek or Roman thing with Gothic temples on it. Anything you like, they would make it. The only person that sort of fought against that was Louis Sullivan. But he was a terrible alcoholic and wasn't really the best champion for these ideas. He did his best to train Frank Lloyd Wright, but he mostly messed him up, and they hated each other as well. So it basically died with that group of people. But Root died before all that happened, so good for him. But today we see what happened in time. And there are engineers that came in the 20th century who picked up this tradition in a way that Root and Viollet-le-Duc would definitely understand. Fazlur Khan being sort of one of the most preeminent, Les Robertson being another, and then really sort of the preeminent practicing structural artists of the day, Bill Baker. Usually we talk about Burj Khalifa, but if you ask him, this is his favorite building, so it seems to me that's the one you should show. This is the Broadgate Exchange House, in which in order to make this building work over a number of train tracks, he essentially built a bridge inside of his building. And it's important also to recognize that when are you seeing something that is true to these principles, and when are you just seeing the structure on the outside? So for instance, a really marvelous building in Hong Kong is the HSBC bank headquarters. It's got these interesting trusses on the outside. It's got all these open spaces on it. But this cost enormous amount of money. So this basically almost, this is built for this bank, which has an infinite level of resources, and couldn't care less about efficiency. There isn't a truss on the outside because they need to show you a truss on the outside. It's because that's the architecture they want you to show. It's called technique. So they want you to see that. It has nothing to do with trying to give you a structural solution which would be most efficient for these problems. Because in fact, you can find open office buildings like this that Baker's designed that didn't cost extra money. And so there are lots of traditions like this, or you can see more recently in these more wild buildings like the CCTV building, which has all of these wonderful papers about how they optimized the steel and made sure that they used the computer programs to put the bracing exactly in the right place. Except, once you've chosen that form, you've picked so much money. It's a huge sculpture. I couldn't care less if they optimized this brace or not. The total cost of the building was already lost, right? So you can see things that people will say to you, oh, I saw this beautiful building, and it was structural. It's like you're talking about, right? It's structural engineering. It's on the outside. And you say, no, not at all. It's much more subtle than that. It takes an understanding of the way a building behaves in order to create structural art, in order to create the things that Root was doing and those modern practitioners were doing. So with that, the final coda, Root's creative powers in structural engineering match those of the artist. So that is the story that I wanted to tell you about the birth of the skyscraper and one John Wellborn Root. Thank you.
Presentation, and I think we have time for a couple of questions, and also just want to let people know that we will have a reception afterwards. There's a couple of events going on in the department now, so our reception will be held upstairs in the faculty lounge area, so that's where we'll head up for wine and cheese after this. But are there any questions for Dr. Shafer?
I was also curious about how elevators contributed to the height increase. So, like, you wouldn't want to take stairs up 10 flight.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't sort of rock through the litany of additional technologies that made the skyscraper possible, but the elevator is an important one. It takes, anytime you have that level of change, it takes a sort of unique confluence of innovation, both people who have the innovation technology that's come in time. Though I would say it wasn't uncommon at the time to have an 8-story walk-up or something like that. So these first buildings that they were making, the elevator was not, it was happening at the same time, and of course the safe elevator, right? So this idea of an elevator that would fall that wouldn't actually crash was a big deal. Yeah, right, because everyone wants to live, right? We're so picky. But yes, there's a number of innovations that brought us there, yeah.
You've told us about what has worked, or what worked, but what about the attempts to make steel high-rise buildings that didn't work? I know that in Chicago, in the concrete building industry, they tried a lot of things that didn't work initially when they were trying to create flat floors without beams, without the column capitals, and they had a lot of catastrophic failures before they got it right. What can you tell us about what happened in the steel side?
Sure. I think there's no reason to even worry about going back in time with the Millennium Building in San Francisco sinking into the ground right now. I mean, I would say that our inability to understand the impact of foundation conditions on high-rise buildings remains the most significant challenge to changing the cost structure around them. I mean, we still really do belts and suspenders designs now for high-rise buildings. For steel buildings in general, the transition from cast iron to steel was a really big deal. Cast iron nodes would often fracture in compression and cause collapses. The steel systems, the early rivet systems were really problematic. It took them a while to get that working, and so they would have quite larger joint flexibility than what they were aiming for, and have serious serviceability problems, and those buildings would have to be taken down. A number of these buildings that don't exist today, it's not just because they wanted to redevelop. The building became unserviceable. And so they had to knock it down. Almost no buildings exist from that first 10 years of construction right after the fire, where they were all using cast iron like crazy, but they weren't fireproofing any of it. And so some of it was taken out because of fireproofing issues, also these workability issues. I would say that once they got to standardized shapes and standardized quality control on the materials, which would put you kind of order 1930s, then you start to see a lot less issues. But prior to that, you would buy a column from a company, and that could mean many, many different things. There's lots of small producers making things that were good or not good, kind of like batch plants for concrete. Like, you need to know who you were working with. But yeah, good point and very interesting.
Any other questions?
Sorry. I had another question. When you go to Chicago, one of the big architects they talk about is Mies van der Rohe, and I think of him kind of as structural art. I don't know what your thought is, but I was curious how he fits in.
So Mies is very controversial in the structural art community. He is definitively the second Chicago school type of, the architects would spend a lot of time talking about him. He uses, these form and function dictums in a way that is a little bit confusing, and you can't tell of which side of the fence he's on. His buildings almost always have a lot of external structure on display. So Seagram Building in New York, everywhere that he's built, there was that kind of building. So let me give you the party line and the personal answer. So the party line would come from David Billington. He decides at this point he's still alive who's a structural artist and who isn't, and not even close. He's an architect. His buildings cost a lot of money. You can look at a lot of detailed decisions that he makes where he makes bad structural engineering decisions because he's trying to express structure, but that's all he's trying to do. That's the party line. The personal line is, I think he's done more for spreading a structural aesthetic to the general population than anyone else. And so I like it because I like that aesthetic even when we don't do it perfectly well, right? So like if you like something, you can appreciate those that do it really well and then just the pop music version of it. So I still like that version. There's a lot more written about Mies than Root. And so I've tried to focus myself on the engineers I could find along the way. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, maybe one last question? And then we'll reconvene upstairs. Okay.
So I'm from California, and LA is not exactly the place that you look at when you view skyscrapers. It's not like we have a lot, and obviously it's on fire half the time, and when it's not, it's seismic. So I was wondering if you ever considered that steel skyscrapers would make their way over, and for LA to be kind of a place where you view skyscrapers both architecturally and structural art-wise?
Well, I mean, the answer will absolutely be yes when they decide that commuting 10 miles and taking 2 hours to do it is untenable. I mean, it's just a density issue. So, I mean, you can look at Tokyo or Hong Kong or Singapore, any place in the world where they've decided that density is a major factor, and then you will see a nice cadre of steel skyscrapers there. It's not clear how tall makes sense. Most cities have a tallest building because they have a tallest personality in the city, not because they need that particular building. But I think that the modern versions of LA, looking 50 years or 100 years out, will, in addition to having the sort of bad little Blade Runner Asian part of town, will also have big sparkling steel skyscrapers because they will be relatively inexpensive to build. We know how to build them in seismic zones, and you'll certainly see them. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you very much for your great presentation today.
Thank you.
I'm Joel Lapis, I'm a department head.
Nice to meet you.